Across Africa and other emerging markets, the most valuable currency is not gold, oil, or data. It's people. But financing the skills needed to unlock that human capital remains one of the continent's greatest challenges. Joining us now is Nikki Germany, CEO of Moringa School, to unpack what sustainable, scalable models for skills financing really look like. Nikki, a very good morning to you, good afternoon, and thank you so much for your time. To kick off our conversation, let us in on how we can build sustainable financing models for skills training, especially in low-income markets.
Good morning, Tabitha. Great to be here. So, this is one of the most important topics of our time. And when we think about the business of education and skills development, just like any other business, somebody has to pay for that. So that person can be the student themselves or the learner. That can be the parent or a guardian. It can be government. It can be employers, or it can be donors. And in low-income economies, obviously the ability to pay of the student or the sponsor, the parent, is sometimes limited, and sometimes the government is limited as well. So I think there's a few ways for us to think about how can we put in place sustainable financing models. So one is the cost of developing these skilling programs is actually quite high as well. You need to develop curriculum, you need quality instructors, you need delivery platforms, you need marketing and admissions costs. And so if you actually think about how do you reduce the cost of that, AI is actually really in changing the way that we think about that. And so I hope that will be able to reduce the cost of some programs in the future. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I think employers have a role to play in this because the employers are the ones who are looking for the skill-ready talent, and yet they actually don't usually pay a cost in developing that talent. So I think there's some very interesting models where it's possible to co-create with employers ways to go about financing so that they're actually able to get first dibs on the skilled talent that comes out, and yet they also help overcome the costs of training some of that talent. And then thirdly, I think there's some interesting financial instruments around that can help with this. Whether they're always applicable in our context or not is a matter for debate. But there are some interesting financial instruments.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Nikki, the elephant in the room here is human capital a bankable asset class yet? And if not, what is missing? And how do you fill in that gap?
Yeah, I mean, I think that depends on what we mean by bankable. If that means investable, then I would say that's emerging. That's an emerging model because investors require piece and also, a real way of tracking what that return is going to be. And so I think that part of it is emerging. And then some of these things that we're seeing with models like income sharing agreements and bonds are ways that we're looking to see how can we marry the data that we have on outcomes to investors who are willing to get a return on that. But I would say while we wait for some of those things to come into place, most of us are just focusing on really developing high quality programs that will lead people into employment outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And before we go into the return on investment when it comes to this marriage that we have here, Nikki, let us look at some of the lessons that Moringa's model is applying to other emerging ed techs trying to scale without subsidies here.
Sure. So Moringa's been on its own journey. We've actually been around for 11 years. And to be honest, we started really small, and we've also had support along the way. MasterCard Foundation has supported through a number of scholarships for people. And over time, we've moved to a much more commercial model. And that journey takes a while. So my first advice to other ed techs is be prepared for that journey and know that it takes a while, and it's only been in the last few years that we've really scaled to become a very large institution now. We have over 4,000 learners joining us every year. So that's number one. Number two, I would say, is just start small, keep it small, focus on your unit economics to make sure that you have a sustainable business, and then pivot and learn over time and scale slowly so that by the time you are ready to scale, you know what that needs to look like and you can be sustainable.
And then how then do we track the return on investment for skills when employment outcomes are uncertain or delayed in today's world?
Yeah, I think we need to look at return on investment from a long-term perspective, because human capital and investment in human capital is a long-term process. And so you look at that from over time, what does that look like for job placement rates, but what's the right scale for job placement rates? For example, we have job placement rates of over 70%, and we look at that over a period of time. We also look at how are our graduates, what does that look like longitudinally? So, for example, we look at salary increases over time. We look at promotions over time from that initial investment of that skill. So looking at that long term is really important. And then I think the other thing is really understanding, what does ROI mean? Does that really always mean a formal job with a fixed employment salary? In our markets, we know it's actually much more common for people to move into other income generating activities, entrepreneurship, gig work and freelance work. And so I think we need to be thinking about also income generation as compared to just employability when we start talking about outcomes from skilling. And so I think they're important things also for potential investors to think about as they look at that.
And just to take a recap on education bonds there, have we seen them really work when it comes to the African context?
We haven't seen a lot happening in terms of education bonds. We've seen more in terms of income share agreements. So an income share agreement is where somebody provides the money up front, usually a commercial investor provides the money up front for somebody to go through, and then that starts getting paid back over time once they move into income generating activities. So there's certainly been a lot of interest in that and a lot of that happening on the continent. It is tied to making sure that there are income agreements later. We need to make sure it's not predatory in terms of the amount that needs to be repaid and the terms of repayment of that. And then education bonds, there's been more focus. There's been some work in South Africa on sort of job placement bonds where an investor will come in and provide the money up front for a skilling program linked to particular outcomes. And then if those outcomes occur, then they are repaid back by somebody. And of course, the big question is who's going to repay back? The government is an obvious person. They would repay back with the initial investment plus return, but often that's not possible. So sometimes that's where DFIs or other philanthropic organisations come in and can also provide that. But that's still an area that's not very well developed on the continent.
Indeed, and Nikki, banking on human capital, very critical. Thank you so much for those great insights.